That's right. I'm at it again. I say, trash your vintage receivers.
Hey, what are you doing? Get that back out. There's nothing wrong with that.
What?
Get that out of the trash can. Why are you throwing away that receiver? There's nothing wrong with it.
I'm in my garage for this video because I'm off work for part of the summer, and I decided to finally tackle a job I've put off for many months, and that means tidying up this place. I also store some of my superfluous hi-fi gear in here, which I want to talk about today. Jeez, it's warm in here. Life is funny sometimes, isn't it? Do you remember a time when you were super into something? You really dived deep into that thing and couldn't imagine ever not being into it because you enjoyed it so much. Then time passes and your attention gradually shifts to other interests that take your fancy. And eventually you discard the thing that you thought you would always love. Over the last few months, I've noticed that my interest is waning on something I thought was really awesome only a few years ago. Vintage receivers. That's right, the old Japanese silver-faced receivers from the 1970s. There was a time, not very long ago, when I was making video after video about my modest collection of receivers by Marantz and Sansui, Pioneer, Yamaha, Luxman, Harman Kardon, and Sherwood. Has my love really faded? Well, yes and no. No, I haven't owned every brand and model of vintage receiver, but the experience has been very consistent across the various models I have owned. And there are a few things that hold true for every single one, which I will discuss. When I started this channel back in early 2020, all I owned was vintage gear by Marantz, Empire, Acoustic Research, Dynaco, Technics, Sansui, KLH, and Advent. But this is not really a vintage hi-fi channel. Not really. I actually started it to show my re-entry and journey back into hi-fi and collecting vinyl records after being out of it for a long time. I didn't set out with, I'm going to buy a bunch of vintage hi-fi gear and make videos about it. It was my starting point, my entry. I had no idea I would get so heavily into record collecting again, for example. I knew relatively little about DACs, Class D amplifiers, streamers, upgrading turntables, or planar magnetic speakers. But I've now had the opportunity to try out all kinds of fantastic gear and share my experiences with you all. Vintage receivers generally look very attractive, stylish, and retro, a look that will never be replicated. It was a brief and unique period when the most high-tech thing you owned was your hi-fi system. And then, by the start of the 1980s, it was all over. Now, various factors were responsible for the decline, and mainstream hi-fi lost its looks and was cheapened. Over the decades, the old silver-faced components were discarded and replaced with horrible black AV receivers and surround sound. Then as time passed, the baby boomers and Gen Xers started to realize that iPods, Sonos, Bluetooth speakers, and earbuds are boring and don't sound that great. They started to remember that old gear they used to own when listening to music was much more fun and engaging. And they started seeing that old gear for sale for dirt cheap on Craigslist or in thrift stores. There was a time when you could pick up monster receivers by Marantz, Sansui, and Pioneer at garage sales for next to nothing, or sitting by the curb for free. Unfortunately, I missed those days by a few years, but my re-entry into home audio was a bit over like 4 years ago when I saw a Marantz 2230 for sale for $75 on Craigslist. And over the next few years, I was able to acquire some really nice models for relatively reasonable prices. But there is a downside. And the downside of these old receivers, without exception, is that each one required some kind of servicing or repair, which meant time and usually substantial extra expense. Receivers are different from other vintage components from that era. Firstly, they are far more complex, with hundreds or thousands of individual parts, circuits, wires, bulbs, and screws inside. They generate quite a bit of heat, which takes its toll on the capacitors, transistors, resistors, and plastic parts inside. And because they get hot, the cases require plenty of ventilation slots, grates, and holes, which allow lots of dust, dirt, hair, insects, and moistures to accumulate inside. None of that is good, especially the moisture. Now, turntables, cassette decks, and speakers from that era are far less complicated and run cool and don't require ventilation at all. So they don't suffer from the same issues. Now, ported speakers can be a source of nasty insects and rodent infestations. So check inside before you bring them into your house. And if you're not electronically minded and can't service them yourself, then you are dependent on a local, competent, and honest technician. I'm lucky to have Jim, who does a great job. But what am I going to do when he decides to pack it in and retire? I don't know if you've noticed, but the price of the more desirable receivers has skyrocketed over the past couple of years. Finding good deals has become much more rare than it was not that long ago. Many owners will have their receivers recapped and restored. That involves replacing dozens of aging capacitors, as well as select transistors, relays, bulbs, and wiring. And as you can imagine, that's a laborious and costly job. Really only financially viable on the more valuable and collectible receivers, unless you have the time and ability to do it yourself. Most old receivers have radio tuning dials and meters that occupy a large percentage of the front panel. The 1970s was a time when FM radio ruled, and having a large, easy-to-read tuning display was standard. There was a lot of advanced technology devoted to pulling in stereo FM radio signals easily and cleanly. And they're called receivers solely because they receive radio broadcasts. And I don't even use that feature. Yes, they look nice, but I feel that it's just for show now. It doesn't have any utility. Are we buying vintage receivers for sound quality? To a degree, yes. They can sound terrific for sure. It's really about the looks, and it's about the nostalgia factor, isn't it? I think so. I've been turning my attention to quality used, pre-owned, second-hand gear from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And I've found tremendous value with integrated amps, preamps, and power amps from those decades. They're less likely to require repairs and are less likely to have sat for years in a dirty, hot, humid, bug and rodent-infested garage or be coated in tobacco tar. And you will get these components at relative bargain prices. In my opinion, amplifiers from 20 to 25 years ago are still very competitive with new modern amplifiers. Do they look as good as the models from the 70s? Well, no, maybe not. Lots of models won't have dedicated inputs for a turntable. Remember, they are from the golden age of the CD. Now, the older vintage amps have a lot of capacitors, transistors, resistors, and wiring inside, but they're pretty straightforward to service. But some of the more modern stuff had replaced those parts with integrated circuits, and many of them proprietary designs, which means if any of those ICs go bad, finding replacements can be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So your amplifier could become unrepairable. Turntables are generally much simpler devices than receivers and are not prone to deterioration from heat. The same can be said of speakers, CD players, and tape machines. They're more vulnerable to physical neglect, aging rubber and plastic parts, and old grease. Also, they are generally simpler to service and repair without needing a soldering iron and an oscilloscope. You may be asking, why are you telling me this? Well, I'm curious if anyone else out there is experiencing similar thoughts. Please don't hesitate to leave your comment below. The whole been there, done that does happen, and you start seeking new horizons and things to explore. And I suppose that's where I'm at this time. If you were wondering, why doesn't Dave talk about his old receivers anymore? Let me tell you, it wasn't deliberate. And I did sell off a lot of them because they were just sitting on shelves, not being used for months. And I've been spending my limited budget on other pieces of gear. Now, you will still see me mixing in videos about vintage 1970s hi-fi gear in the future, with turntables in particular. And there is so much exciting modern hi-fi devices to check out, and cool upgrades, mods, and accessories that I want to get my hands on. And not to mention tube gear. So I have tons of future video ideas in the works. Listen, if you dig vintage receivers, I'm not going to criticize you at all. I get it, and I definitely appreciate their appeal. They're awesome in many, many ways. However, I've been shifting my attention to more modern units because I'm finding a lot more value there. And I'm not limiting myself to a select number of models from a relatively brief decade-long period of time. The subsequent 4 decades following the 1970s produced an enormous quantity of incredible hi-fi to buy and explore. Over here is like a ridiculous setup here with a Luxman's 1970s receiver. It's an R3045, and underneath it is was a very nice Toshiba DVD player that plays CDs. It's beautifully made, all copper inside, but it is noisy. And there's the, I use this with the Bluetooth receiver for here in the garage. I'm running the Bluetooth through this shit Modi 3 DAC. Here's a turntable I'm selling. It's a SL1200 Mark II, and I still love vintage turntables. For the money, you can't beat them. Nothing modern for the price. You can pick up one of these like for $400, and you can't get anything close to this new for $400. It's not even close. So these are amazing turntables, but I already have one. This is a spare. It's a little bit beat up. Used to be a DJ table, but it works great. I had it serviced and repaired. Now what I have over here, let's see what I got here. Well, I got this really nice little Harman Kardon 330C. It's nice, it's been serviced. Here's a Nakamichi TA4A that I'm not using. Oh, here's an Adcom, their very first preamp they ever made, the GFP1, sitting on top of some Polk monitor with a 5 Juniors. Here's some ADS C7s with bad mid-range and bad woofers. I don't know what they're going to do about these. I have to get them serviced or something. I bought them, I knew they were broken. I got them cheap, but who knows, I'll get them fixed. Here is a 10-inch big Velodyne subwoofer I'm trying to sell. Here is a NAD. It's the receiver. It's the 7220. Really nice little receiver from the 80s. Fantastic little receiver. Up here, there is a Marantz 2230 that I've had for a few years. Don't use it very often, or hasn't been used in a long time. My wife doesn't really listen to records much lately because she's very busy with school. Now, sitting on my desk, I've been using this Name integrated amp. There's the remote. And it's sitting on top of a Sansui 881 receiver, which I really love. It's my favorite receiver I've probably ever owned. I might hold on to this one. It's fantastic. It's been partially recapped. Works really well. Sounds good. But I don't know. I think I might prefer the sound of the more modern Name integrated amp. But it's just it's a warmer, more vintage sound. This is a kind of a cleaner, more what's the word? Punchy sound in the Name. But both are great.